So I want to take a few moments now to introduce assignment 3 and give you some thoughts on that. And then we'll go on and we'll look at metaphor and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes for this week. If you have any questions at any stage, you can send me an email. You can also send an email asking for a phone consultation if you want to speak by phone, and I can send you my mobile and you can have a chat there. So don't panic. If you have any difficulties at all, get in touch. I think as well, whenever you do any assignment, there is also going to be some sense of fear and apprehension before you get into it, in that you don't really know what's there until you get into it. And then I think as you're gathering the information, you get a bit more confident. And then when you're 2/3 of the way through, then you have quite a lot of confidence. And it's amazing how much confidence you have at the end of your study period. And often that's a good time to write your introduction and conclusion and read through it all and structure it all. With the second assignment, which I've just been marking, some of the things that I would point out. Firstly, there is a tension in this subject between primary texts, which is the Bible text or the text of Tobit, and secondary texts, which are scholarly writings. And I think it's very true that you'll never become a great Old Testament scholar unless you read the Old Testament books in the primary text. And these days you could get a hold of the Hebrew and you could look at the Hebrew text and get a bit familiar with that over your period of study. And it is amazing how much you can learn a language after 6 months or more looking into the language. So I think Australia needs great Old Testament scholars. If you'd like to be an Old Testament scholar, then you could sign up for that. I think like any studies, it takes 6 or 12 months to get your certificate or diploma, takes 2 or 3 years to get bachelor level. And then when you put a bit more in, you master the subject and they give you a master's. Since you will already have a bachelor at some stage, then you could in fact get a master's by adding 2 years of study to your bachelor. So you go on and you could do a master's in biblical studies if you wish. I would encourage that. If you want to do New Testament studies, you could do Greek and you could study a book of the New Testament in the ancient Greek, and that would be valuable as well. And I started to go down that direction and studied some Hebrew and Greek. And then I thought it'd also be good to study the contemporary world. So I studied psychology and sociology and contemporary studies as well. So I think you have to make those decisions. Where is your expertise going to be, and can you major in more than one area? So firstly, I'm saying that you need to study the primary text. So read the chapter of your book, get familiar with it, read the book in which it's set, get familiar with it. And so if you're going to do a study of a psalm, then you need to read the psalm. If you're going to do a study of another book like Job, you need to do Job. Today we'll be looking at Proverbs, and if you're going to do a study of Proverbs chapter 8, you need to read some of the Proverbs, particularly Proverbs 8, and get familiar with it. At the same time, I think as a student who is only studying for 13 weeks in this subject, it is hard to become an expert on the text within the 13 weeks. And so I would advise you, read the scholars. And I think the more scholars you read, perhaps the better and stronger your understanding can be. Certainly you don't need to read large numbers of scholars. You do need to read strong scholars. And so if you read 3 strong scholars, then I think you could have a good understanding of the topic. If you only read one, you'll only ever summarize the views of that one scholar. If you read 2 or 3 or more, then you'll know something of scholars' views. And I think that if you read 10 or 15 scholarly resources, my view is that you can have expertise. So I'd say in marking assignment 2, I think additional understanding of the text comes through reading the works of strong scholars, focusing on 2 or 3 strong scholars, and also focusing on some of the key ideas. So I think ideas or themes can really strengthen your assignment in that you can dig deeper. And some of the strongest of the assignment 2s picked up a theme such as identity or such as ethics or such as how we relate to others and see others. So when you focus on a strong idea or theme, that improves your assignment. The other thing I would say is that assignments are enormously lifted by structure and editing. So if you structure your assignment with a strong introduction and conclusion and a strong unified argument throughout every paragraph that combines them all around one central argument, you will look as though you master the subject, even if you don't. And the important thing is you have to look as though you master the subject, I think. That's what politicians do all the time. And so the structure does that and the editing does it. I've seen PhD students who show me material and you think you couldn't get a certificate with this sort of material, but that's because they've not edited it. When they go back and edit it and polish it, then you see it finished. Same with woodworkers. I've seen woodworkers start building a table and they've just got a rough bit of timber and they're talking about what they're going to do. You could never sell that, but it's when they've polished it and run the sandpaper over it, finished it off. And I think sometimes you need 50% of the time given to the editing to make it really show that it flows smoothly and master it. So they're the comments I'd make on assignment 2 is look at the primary text, get into it, interact with scholarly writings, focus on a key theme or idea, have a strong structure and edit and rework. With assignment 3, you're asked to write on one piece of poetic literature, and the poetic literature that you have been suggested are 2 or 3 passages. And these 2 or 3 passages are, firstly, the Song of Deborah. So I don't know if you might tell me in a moment whether you're going to choose Judges 5, Song of Deborah. That's the one where her hand reached for a tent peg and she stuck it in Sisera and crushed his head and shattered and pierced his temple. And so we could think about metaphor here. Is this just a gory piece of literature, or is there a metaphor that speaks to us when we read it? And I would suggest there may be a metaphor. Anyone got thoughts on, can anyone see a metaphor there? Put a hand up if you can see a metaphor, and then I'll ask Matthew if he can see a metaphor. Who can see a metaphor in Judges 5, verse 26? She shattered and pierced the temple of this king who was an opponent and problem to Israel. What's the possible metaphor there? Well, how does it speak to your heart and emotions when you read that? That's a little bit similar to Exodus 15, where they're riding chariots and the waters opened up and they ride through. And then the waters come back in and they wash all the Egyptians away and they drown. How does that sort of speak to your emotions when you've had a hard day and the lecturer has given you a low grade in your assignments? Anyone see a metaphor? Any thoughts? Does it speak to your emotions, to your heart? Yeah. 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 Right. Yeah, well, there's lots of ways to read it. And so one way of reading it is that the peg is doing the work, but she's, yeah, you can play with that. Yeah. The other thing that I get is that perhaps they're not just crushing the head of one king, that this represents the possibility that all the enemies of Israel could be crushed. And so the king who is crushed could metaphorically stand for all enemies of Israel. And so I think when you read that, a bit like when you read David and Goliath gets hit in the head and falls, sometimes all these sermons you've heard on that will come back to you and you'll think, wow, I think I could defeat the Goliaths in my life. And so assignment 3, it's just possible that I could bowl that over. And the word bowl it over is a metaphor that I'm using there. So I think metaphoric language, like poetry and song, really speaks deep within us. So there's one possibility. So some of you may be interested in the Song of Deborah. So that's the whole of Judges 5. You can have a read through that. And to me, it speaks to me of all enemies crushing. Eve, any thoughts on what it speaks to you about? I was thinking of that one with the crushed head by the tent peg. Does that speak to you at all? Get you motivated to? Yeah, yeah. So there's another thing that you could explore. Are there reasons for wanting to do this? And one of the reasons could be justice. And so if there's been injustice and justice, that could be explored. One of the things that Paul Ricoeur says is that each one of us in this class will read the passage with different eyes and will see different things. Now, as evangelical Christians, we would say that God's Spirit could be speaking to each one of us in different ways about our lives. And so that's why we're getting these different ideas coming through. And that's one of the dangers of reading commentaries. And that's why they would suggest that be careful. Each time you read a commentary, you're getting into the groove of that person's way of thinking. And if you only read American commentaries, you'll become an American. If you only read British commentaries, you'll become British. If you read French commentaries, that would shape your thinking in different ways as well. So further thoughts on this tent peg? Any thoughts on the tent peg? Yeah. 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 After leaving Egypt and go. Yes. How that like ends how though I know how does that section something. Yeah. Yeah. And so if we read the whole of Judges 5, then that would bring up the entire Song of Deborah, and you could choose the whole chapter or you could choose a portion of it. So when the princes take the lead, when the people willingly offer themselves, hear this, kings and rulers. When you, Lord, went out, the earth shook and the heavens poured, the clouds poured down water, the mountains quaked. And so there's a lot of metaphor there, as when God walks upon the earth, then mountains shake and heaven shake. And the question, of course, is, what does that mean metaphorically there? And one of the things we're going to be reading today is about fear of the Lord. And so that's one passage that you can look at. Another passage you could look at the end of chapter 5, it says, may all your enemies perish. May all who love you like the sun rise in its strength. The land had peace. And so one of the things I see there is the question, is this conditional? So is peace and victory conditional? And so we would say with Proverbs and many other passages that it is conditional. And so when you're obedient to the word of God and the teachings of God, you're more likely to have success. But last week we looked at the book of Job, and there can be times when you can still have tragedy come upon your life. Book of Ecclesiastes, things happen in everyone's life. So Paul Ricoeur, I would suggest if you have time to read, one of the great philosophers of the last 100 years. The other passage you can look at is Job's complaint in Job 3 for assignment 3. And so lament, may the day of my birth perish, may be turned to darkness. So there's the whole passage there in Job 3. So if you want a good sad passage to look at, then as a balance to all the positive passages that we read and the positive messages we get from church. Here is a good negative message that you could preach next time you're asked to preach. So, may the day of my birth perish. May gloom and utter darkness claim my birthday once more. There's a good stirring passage for a sermon. And then you can see I'm playing with irony here. And I think this has the possibility of a pastoral care assignment that talks about the value of lament. So if you're interested in the value of lament in pastoral care, then Job chapter 3 has a lot there. And in pastoral care, it speaks of listening. In pastoral care, it speaks of safe space to express your doubt. In terms of people in church today, it reminds us that churches can find value in not just having a positive message, everything will go well, but churches can find value in having a safe, open space for people to express their doubts and problems. Now, if you've ever watched any of the TV programs that situate a church on television, you'll see that most of them you're not allowed to raise questions to the minister. You know, this is what we believe. And so I think many people would say that's not so healthy. What we really want is ministers who are open to the questioning. And so that's Job 3. So that's the second passage that you can look at for this assignment. And then the other one is Proverbs chapter 8, where wisdom cries out. And we'll look at that one today. So there are three assignment questions. If you have another poem that you feel would be very strongly on your heart, then you can have a look at that, have a talk to me about that. But they're the three we're suggesting. And then chapter 8 of Proverbs says, wisdom cries out, counsel and sound judgment are mine. And so after today's lesson, you might have some ideas that you could look at for this assignment. So any questions about assignment 3? Matthew, do you have any questions about assignment 3? And then I'll go around the class and ask if there's a question about assignment 3. And maybe you could suggest what passage you'd like to look at. Matthew, any questions or thoughts on the passage you'd look at?
No questions, but I can offer what I'm looking at.
Yeah.
I'm interested in Job 3.
Yep.
There's this idea around at the moment, antinatalism.
Yeah. What's antinatalism?
It's just this idea that it is more ethically, it's more ethical not to bring life into this world full of suffering.
Wow.
And so obviously Job curses the day that he is born, and you can really see that he's really kind of there is an alignment there. Better not to have lived at all rather than to live in a world with suffering. So there's this idea I could look at there.
Yeah. And Matthew, I think that will make for a very strong assignment, because you've got a strong theme there in antinatalism. If you wanted a quote there, I could suggest that you take one of those who went, a German National Socialist who went through World War II, who decided to not have children. So there were a few Germans at the end of World War II decided that because their party, the National Socialists, had done such dreadful things, they decided to not have children, and that fits with your theme a little bit. There are also people today deciding to not have children, as you say, because we live in such times. So I think there's a few things there. There may be something that connects with the whole question of suicide. And so, again, this connects with pastoral care, listening, safe space, etc. So any thoughts on what passage or any questions for assignment 3?
I'm not 100% sure
Mm.
what I'm going to do yet.
Yeah.
I have some ideas, but I'm not
Yeah.
sure what will make up my whole plan.
Yeah. If you pursued an idea, any thoughts what the idea might be?
I like the poetry that I found in Ruth.
Right.
It was really nice. And it was, yeah, I sometimes forget it was there, even though it's a very
Mm.
quote. I forgot it was in that book. But I liked it. It was nice.
Yeah, yeah. So we could talk a little bit about the possibility of developing that further. The strength of that is that you already have some knowledge to build on. And we say you can't really be borrowing words from there, but if you've got background knowledge, then it makes a project that's consistently going forward. Yeah. Thoughts on this assignment? Yeah.
Probably thinking that was related to message about
Mm.
or possibly probably one might be like
Yep. 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 Which one in the New Testament?
Mary song.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yep. And again, we're looking at literary aspects of metaphor that we'll talk about today, but we're also looking at other things that are happening from a literary perspective, and also we're talking about major ideas. Thoughts, Anne?
Yeah, I really like the shoes, yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I just don't know. I'll
Mm.
have to like read them and
Mm.
read it and read it. But I don't know if it's just like this.
Sounds good. Yeah. 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 So Deborah and you could do a bit of background. Be careful though, if you do too much background on the character of Deborah, then you could get away from the theme of the second assignment, which is poetry. And so one of the things that you could include there is the power of poetry. And so poetry does have power, and it works in certain ways in our mind. And so I think that strengthens. Yeah. 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 That sounds great. So let's stop there for about 3 minutes or so, and then we'll restart in about 3 to 5 minutes. So let's take a little break.